Assuming the presidency after the assassination of JFK was Lyndon Baines Johnson, another of our presidents about whom opinion from historians is mixed, although Johnson is generally regarded as not among our greatest presidents, and his role in getting us deeper and deeper involved in the Vietnam War is a major factor in that. And yet he's another of these presidents who, about whom the full picture is more complex. And so we need to learn a little bit more about this man, Lyndon Johnson. He was born in 1908 in rural small-town Texas, and raised in poverty. He is truly one of that small number of our presidents about whom it might be said he rose from virtually nothing. He rose from poverty all the way to the White House. And so I think there's something admirable in that, even if we have many other questions about his presidency. His early career may not have seemed the work of one destined for the White House. He became a school teacher in rural Texas, but eventually found himself dissatisfied with the work. He moved to Washington, D.C. with just a few pennies in his pocket and started working at the very bottom rungs of employment in Washington, D.C., and eventually started to work his way up through the FDR administration as a minor official, and eventually working his way up to elected office in Congress and eventually in the Senate. He was a tireless worker. He slept only a couple of hours each day, frequently stayed in his office overnight. If not, he was the first one in and the last one to leave. And he was also a master politician, a very skilled and tough negotiator. He was known for what was called the Johnson treatment. He would get right up in people's face. He would lean into people and jab his finger into their chest, all of which you see in the picture at the right. He was a tall and physically imposing man, and he also kept a meticulous kind of mental count of scores to be settled and votes that had been cast, and he always knew when to call on someone to repay a political favor. At the same time, one can scarcely imagine a greater contrast with the graceful and elegant Camelot days of the Kennedys. Johnson was crude, not terribly likable. He belched, scratched himself. He swam naked in the White House pool. He also had a way of bending the truth. He was not above telling small lies to get his way. And as we discussed with the case of Vietnam, small lies led to bigger and bigger lies down the road, which created the credibility gap that we talked about during that chapter. As one saying had it around Washington, how do you know when he's telling the truth? When he scratches his head, rubs his chin, or knits his brow, he's telling the truth. When he begins to move his lips, he's lying. And so Johnson has the unfortunate reality of being associated with this lack of honesty, lack of integrity, and the credibility gap. At the same time, Lyndon Johnson had a hugely ambitious plan to improve the plight of average people and poor people in the country. And he very skillfully used the memory of John F. Kennedy to push for an extension of the legislation that Kennedy had at times only talked about. But it was Johnson, the master politician, who made much of it a reality. In February of 1964, he pushed a $10 billion tax cut, which contributed to the economic boom that stretched deep into the decade of the 60s. He pushed through housing legislation, the creation of food stamps, And in the summer of 1964, a $1 billion spending measure called the Economic Opportunity Act, which created an array of anti-poverty measures. This act, among other things, created Head Start, a program that some of you early education majors might be familiar with, providing economic assistance for preschool programs. He also created something called the Job Corps, which was sort of a domestic version of the Peace Corps. Let's send people out into the communities in our own country to help people, write their resumes and get prepared for the workplace, and many other measures as well. From 1963 to 1968, in part due to the robust economy and in part due to measures like this, poverty fell from 20% to 13%. At the same time, as we will be discussing in other parts of this lecture, over that same period, the nation became mired in, at times, violent uprisings, the civil rights movement growing more violent, a variety of other movements gaining pace, and so there seemed to be an increasing amount of discontent, protest, and even rioting across the country. All of these kinds of problems are going to lead in the late years of the 1960s to a conservative backlash as conservatives come to object to this extension of federal money and federal benefits to those at the bottom of the economic scale. As one person commented in 1969, there are too many people receiving welfare who ought to be working. The beginnings of this conservative backlash can be seen in the 1964 presidential election, in which Republicans nominated Barry Goldwater, a senator from Arizona. Goldwater boldly and at times viciously attacked the Democrats and Lyndon Johnson in the not-too-distant aftermath of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. This kind of appeal was also tinged with a bit of racism, as Goldwater appealed openly to white Southern voters, while Johnson, of course, appealed to the black vote that had gone to John F. Kennedy in the 1960 election. At the same time, Goldwater perhaps strayed too far to the extreme, and Lyndon Johnson and his advisors were able to successfully depict Goldwater as something of a dangerous reactionary. Goldwater at times misstepped during the campaign, mentioning that he would consider using nuclear weapons against Cuba or against North Vietnam if necessary. And these kinds of statements in an age in which there was already plenty to be worried about, just cast more fear into the hearts of many Americans. And so Lyndon Johnson, who was writing the memory of John F. Kennedy, who was writing his own Great Society agenda, who was riding the wave of legislation that had been passed, and was also able to kind of cast these fears about Barry Goldwater, rode to a sweeping landslide victory in the election in 1964, winning 61% of the popular vote and winning the electoral vote 486 to 52. This is a series of snapshots from a television advertisement, a very famous ad known as the Daisy Girl ad. And if you watch the commercial itself, and you can find it very easily on YouTube, there's sort of a clock ticking in the background, and the girl is picking the daisy, and then a nuclear explosion goes off. And it says simply, "Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. And the suggestion is that this is what would happen to us if Barry Goldwater were elected president. This seems perhaps almost a ridiculous kind of suggestion. It's so unrealistic, and yet at the time we have to remember this seemed like a very real possibility. We're not too far past things like the Cuban Missile Crisis, and World War III and nuclear war was on everyone's mind. So this was actually a very successful advertisement that planted those seeds of fear about Barry Goldwater.